Usually I have two. First one's going to be on the February 6th, and the second one will be on February 27th. So we aren't 100% sure who those people will be yet, but I think maybe we'll try to get indie publishing people. The second one is we are a little closer to the publishing lectures, and we'll see who we bring in for talking about character. So that's what we're going to be doing. Like I told you last time, we're going to go 3 weeks on each topic. And your questions that you write down in your take your quiz by 8:45, we will save those for the Q&A lecture. And that's when I will try to dig into those. Usually I get to like 3 of them, and then there's enough questions from the crowd and tangents that I don't answer everything you write down, but it is the nice way that we keep rolling. It does give me a starting point for going into the Q&A lectures. So we're going to do plot first. I kind of go back and forth on where I start. I should say back and forth and further forth, because there's stories are built up generally of 3 things. They're built up of your plot, your setting, and your character. And the intersection of plot, setting, and character is conflict. What you're looking for is how to create that conflict. And as far as stories go, setting, plot, and character all should exist to create some sort of conflict or to facilitate some sort of conflict, because that's what your story is about. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I actually took notes this time. Yes, I know. Look at that. So what's the purpose of plot? Right? What do we talk about when we mean plot? I often talk about plot in kind of 2 different categories, and I label them big P plot and little p plot. A capital P plot and a little p plot. Capital P plot is when someone says, "What is your book about?" That's what you tell them. This is what you can boil it down to in a sentence or 2 plot. What is The Lord of the Rings about? It's about a furry-footed British dude taking a magic ring and trying to throw it in a pit, right? That's the funny way of putting it, but you know what I mean. Like, what is The Lord of the Rings about? It's trying to destroy Sauron through destroying this ring that is the conflicts of his power. Little p plot is what happens chapter by chapter in order to keep the reader engaged. So the plot of Lord of the Rings might be destroy the ring, but the lowercase p plot might be, all right, there's some orcs here and we can't get past them. What do we do? Well, we'll dress up like them, right? Like that sort of thing. How do you, it's the small little problem and then you resolve it. Small little problem, resolve it, building toward larger problems that you're hopefully resolving. Next week, we're going to talk about plot frameworks. So today, we're not going to talk about the hero's journey or plot archetypes or things like that. Instead, we're going to talk about the general idea of what plot is for. And in my mind, plot is for a couple of things. First is facilitate conflict. It's going to be the primary way that you create conflict in your story. A thing needs to happen, and the characters need to do it, and something is standing in their way. Pretty obvious. The second thing, though, a plot is there to give the reader some structure, to give the reader something to hang on to give them a sense that a story is being told and is moving along. Plot tends to be the one, because of these reasons, that is the most difficult to innovate upon. Plot, setting, and character, I'd say setting is the easiest place to innovate. Character, second easiest. Plot is the most difficult. There are various, and we'll talk about them next week, various plot frameworks, but there's certain things people expect in a satisfying story. And yes, you can subvert those, and most of the ways you would subvert those just makes your story unsatisfying. Now, you may want to tell an unsatisfying story. There are reasons to do that. But in general, you're looking to tell a satisfying story, and there are certain things that work for that and certain things that don't. And because of that, you'll notice that if you go on and start Googling plot and start researching it, people will be like, there's only 3 plots. There's only 7 plots. There's only 1 plot, right? The hero's journey, he would be like, yep, there's 1 plot. It's been told in all these different ways. But he stretched a ton to make that count. I don't know how many plots there are. But I can tell you that innovating here is not necessarily something that needs to be done. In general, if you are combining your plot with interesting characters in an interesting setting, and you are kind of using what we're going to talk about today in this class, you're going to create something that is going to read and it's going to feel fresh and unique, right? It doesn't matter that Dune is Hamlet, right? Is the Lion King, right? Right down to the break in the middle of Lion King and Dune, which I've always found interesting, that both of them are like, we're going to skip all the growing up part, right? Maybe it's because Hamlet, he was already grown, and that Hamlet skipped the whole first half of the story, and it's Hamlet's the second half. But there's something about that story. Son is wronged as father dies and uncle seizes the throne. Son goes away and comes back stronger, maybe crazier in Hamlet's case, and becomes a rival for the uncle's throne, killing the uncle and restoring order to the Pride Lands, or whatever they call them, right? To Arrakis. You would not look at The Lion King and Dune and be like, wow, those are the exact same story, even though the general concept, the general structure is the same structure, right? You've probably, I would guess, never thought that Dune was Hamlet. Everyone talks about Lion King being Hamlet, so you probably already knew that one. But the fact that they share these very similar plot structures, even to the point that it's like the uncle and things like this, doesn't make these stories feel unfresh or unoriginal. In fact, Dune is probably my favorite book of all time. And so because of that, you can use plot as a tool. Plot should be, in my opinion, one of these places where the chef knows what works and can use it to their advantage with only taking pieces and parts. You'll even notice, like, as I said, when Shakespeare wrote this story, to tell the story he wanted to, he started with Hamlet arriving back, right? Well, when Dune tells this story, it backs up and shows all of this and the wrongs being committed that need to be righted. The stories are trying to do different things. And so, it's in The Lion King, you need cute, plucky animal sidekicks. In Dune, you need an animal that will eat you if you walk without rhythm. So the different needs are different for the different stories. Now, I think that plot breaks down to this idea of promise, progress, and payoff. And all the frameworks we'll talk about next week and the ways of constructing a plot will kind of rely on this same concept. You might be saying to me, Brandon, I am naturally more of a pantser. I like to write by the seat of my pants. I don't like to have a structure. As I mentioned with Stephen King, he feels that if he makes an outline, he's already told his story, and it makes it harder for him to then go tell his story because discovering the story is part of what drives him to write. Don't worry, you can do all of this while discovery writing. Right? Now, the frameworks we'll talk about next week, some of those, if you're a discovery writer, you just don't want to use. Right? You don't want to sit down and use 7-point story structure. But the more you learn about the core concepts of what makes people read books and enjoy them, the more you can apply that as you're discovering your story. And one thing to be aware of is the difference between discovery writers and outliners, and again, everyone falls on the spectrum between, and indeed most people are a little of both, and it changes based on project. Most people spend about the same amount of time. The outliner spends it up front. The discovery writer spends it on the back end, right? And these sorts of things we're talking about are often really handy tools for analyzing a story that's gone wrong. In fact, that's kind of a theme for this whole class. When you sit down to write, a lot of times writers are not thinking, what is the progress here, right? I do, because that's how I analyze story, but I think most people are writing by instinct, and then if something doesn't work, writers back up and say, all right, what's the disconnect here? And they will often arrive at things that essentially mean, I've made a promise, but my progress is something different. How do I fix that? Well, I go back generally and make new promises, because the progress that I'm writing along is what I want to tell the story about. So don't worry and feel that you have to learn all of this up front and apply it to your outline before you start writing your book. Writing will teach you how to do this better than any other activity will, as we talked about last week. So take all of these things, use them as analytical tools to help you begin understanding story, and if things are broken, then maybe you can analyze them according to some of the things we talk about. And if you're an outliner, they might be really handy in making your outlines. So, questions on any of that before we talk about promises? Yes?
How much of this is just North American culture?
Yeah. So how much of this is I would say Western storytelling traditions, right? But really modern Western storytelling traditions. How much is it? This is a little bit hard for me to put a point on, because definitely in Asia, Japan, Korea, China, you're going to see a different use of payoff most often. That's where they deviate the most. The payoff there, based on kind of subtle storytelling archetypes over time, means something different, and what is satisfying to that audience can be different. That said, they are homogenizing. Whether for good or for ill, you are seeing more and more of ambiguous endings being more popular in the West, and you're seeing more payoff endings in the East, and both are kind of viable. It just depends on what kind of payoff that you want to have. You still generally use in some of the Eastern styles of storytelling, even going back, if you're going to read Journey to the West, right? You're going to see kind of the same progress and promise methodology. You're just going to see very different payoff methodology. Excellent question. So, yeah, go ahead.
Just out of curiosity, when you're writing something, like when you've been writing something longer, like Stormlight or something, where would you put yourself on the scale between discovery and outliner?
Discovery and outliner. So every author, then the question is, so it can be repeated for the camera, where, like on Stormlight in particular, would I put myself between outliner and pantser, or whatever? Every author is a pantser, is discovery writing at the core as they're working, right? Even if you have bullet points, you're still discovery writing. Like, nobody's outline is as long as their story, so you're always discovery writing something. I remember a famous story that I was told that I have not been able to confirm. I tried very hard, and I think it might just be apocryphal. But the story I was told when I was young is that in the movie E.T., the screenplay just said, Elliot and E.T. escape on the bikes, right? And at least in one of the drafts, and then that became the most iconic scene in the film. A lot of times your outline will say, the characters escape, and then you have to discovery write that, right? So the outliner, it's a bit of a misnomer to call anyone truly an outliner, because it's just how much pantsing you are comfortable with. I tend to fall much more on the outlining side for everything, and the longer the series, the more detailed my outlines are. That is because I'm kind of throwing myself footballs and then trying to catch them 15 years later, right? And the better guess I have where I am, the easier it will be to catch those footballs. That said, I knock out walls that I would have considered load-bearing, and I change things around. And as you write, the story matures. And So even myself, who I consider myself one of the more hardcore outliners that I know, I would say that more discovery writer than outliner in general, just compared to other people I outline more. And here's a fun thing for you. Here's anecdote time, and then I'll get to this question. I have been on many panels on writing, and I generally find myself one of the few outliners. This has changed over time. I find that there are more outliners now than there used to be, but I still tend to be in the minority. And so I talk about myself as kind of being odd sometimes as such a strong outliner. I once sat on a panel in Germany, and I kid you not, I said this and like how I do it, and all the Germans looked at me and they're like, no, that's how it's done. I'm like, no, there's discovery writing. They're like horrified. They're like, people do that without a structure? I thought it was funny. It's a little bit of stereotype, but it literally happened that all the Germans are like, it's insane to not have an outline. All right, question here, and then we'll do this one, then we'll do, yeah.
How do you come to terms with dropping plots or plans that you feel are core to your story?
How do you come to terms with dropping plots or plans that you feel are core to your story? How do you come to terms with killing your darlings, which is a famous screenwriting terminology for this sort of thing? You tell yourself a lie, okay? I'm going to tell you what the lie is. I will find a much better place for this character, plot, or idea where it can shine in its own story. And then 9 times out of 10, you won't, because that idea actually wasn't that great. You just built the whole story upon it. The story then evolved, because the process of building a story is where the real creativity takes off. And as you start writing it, you start applying all of your ideas, and that thing that started you actually is not as good as the rest of it, and part of you realizes it. Once in a while, that 1 out of 10, that lets you have plausible deniability on your lie. Once in a while, that 1 out of 10 becomes its own story, and it deserves that space and time. I will say this, just as a blanket, I almost always throw away my first chapters, often my first several chapters of a given book, and write them over once I'm finished. This is how you can tell, even though I'm an outliner, discovery writing and really focusing on the progress side of this, which is in many ways the most important, but the least showy, right? It's the one that people will pay attention to the least, but it's 90% of your book. Once you know what that progress is, you then know how to signpost that for people to enjoy it, and throwing away your early chapters is really common in the industry. So this is one of the reasons why it's best not to become... Where's Nate? Not to become an eternal, hey, you were right there, and I just looked past you. Not to learn as Nate has done, to not keep revising your first chapters until you've finished your book, because for most of us, you won't really be able to do that until you've gotten far enough along to know how to make those promises. So thank you for being 2 years running my really great example on this. So, all right, I'm going to go into promises, then we will do more Q&A, okay? So, promises. Promises are the easy one, okay? You should not stress promises at the beginning of your book, because once you learn your progress and once you've written an ending, and if you're a discovery writer, it'll be a bad ending. Don't stress that either. Once you know what the core of your book is about, throwing away 3 chapters and rewriting it so that your promise nails what you want to do in your story is easy. Throwing away 40 chapters in the middle is hard, right? If you just look at the weight of time. So, but promises in many ways are the most important. They're the easiest, but most important. Why are they most important? Well, you might have heard people talk about how important your hook or your first line is and things like that. I find rarely do first lines actually matter. We like to talk about them. Usually it's your first couple